Okay, so now we're on page 8 of A Christmas Carol, and we're going to carry on our reading and annotation. So you may want to look back at the previous pages to see where we were, but remember, Scrooge has just got home. He's gone to open his door, and Marley's face has appeared in the door knocker. He's gone in, he's slammed the door, and the kind of noise of the slamming the door has been echoing around the house. So we're getting these kind of ghostly features coming in here, and Dickens is establishing that everything is not as it seems. And this contrasts with the fact that Scrooge has had his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. So that, life up until this point has just been as it has been for years, and all of a sudden things are different. So let's go from here. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament, but I mean to say you might have got a hearse up that staircase, and taken it broadwise, with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Okay, let's look at what's going on there. The writer or the narrator is basically talking about saying that Scrooge's staircase is so wide that you could have got a carriage with 6 horses going up the staircase. So he's saying, well, yes, it is possible because the staircase is wide enough. But actually, the key thing here is that the next thing that Scrooge sees, the next ghostly thing, is that he thinks he sees a hearse, which is kind of like a funeral car, going up the stairs. So this is the next clue before the arrival of Marley's ghost. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. So again, this is a really important quotation. He keeps his house in the dark because he's so mean. He doesn't want to spend any of his money. So this is a really important quote here. I don't know why I'm going around it twice. It's also sort of representative of how he treats others. He doesn't spend money on himself, and therefore, he doesn't want to waste money on people like Bob Cratchit. We can even note that here. Represents how he treats others. And I'm going to put, that word from the beginning, that present participle, scraping, as if he's sort of scraping the pennies together. Remember how we talked about how ironic that was, considering he's not actually poor. He doesn't have to scrape by, but he lives this kind of, impoverished existence. That's a nice word for you. Let's see if we can fit that on here. Impoverished, which means, being poor. You can see that word poverty in the middle there. He lives an impoverished existence. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head upon the hob. So again, we've got this image of gruel. All right, gruel means porridge. Porridge is very cheap. So this again kind of links to this idea that he won't spend money on anything. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. So essentially what this is telling us is that everything is normal, everything is as it should be, just as he says. Okay, let's move down. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. So actually there is a little hint here that he's feeling slightly suspicious. He knows something is not quite right. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, that's like his tie, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. So he's now having like his supper. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it, but he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one and built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. So now we've got Scrooge sat at the fire, and just like we had with Bob Cratchit at work, it's a very low fire, so a very small fire. He has to get really close to feel any warmth, to extract the warmth from it. So these images of cold and warm keep coming back. Now, when we get a repeating image coming back over and over again, we call it a motif. Okay, so this kind of motif of cold, or the motif of the fire, and these images are really, really important. And we'll look at them when we've read the whole story through, and we'll kind of map them out. So he's looking at the fireplace, and sort of round the fire, you have the kind of fire surround, and it's got some sort of tiles on it there. All right, and they've got pictures from the Bible, from the scripture. There were Cain and Abel's, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abraham, Balthazar's, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod, and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's face on every one. Okay, so essentially he starts seeing Marley's face in the fireplace. First he saw it on the door knocker, and now he's seeing Marley's face in the fireplace. Not just in the fireplace, he's seeing it, Marley's head on each little person, the picture of each little person around the fire. But that essentially is the idea. Humbug, said Scrooge, and walked across the room. So he's still completely in denial here. After several turns he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange inexplicable dread that as he looked he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. So this is the next kind of strange thing that happens. Now remember, historically, in a big old house like this, it would have normally had servants, and in each room there would have been a bell or a rope that you could pull that would ring a bell, so that you could get the servants' attention. So it's these bells that are now ringing out. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if a person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." Okay, if you want to pick out some of those bits about the chains, then you can do, but we'll come back to them. So we've got sort of dragging chains here. We've got sort of clanking noises, and it says here again, person dragging a heavy chain. So obviously it's really important that Scrooge is trying to convey this idea that whoever it is has got these chains. But we'll look a little bit more at that at the top of page 9. So previously we had this kind of stubborn refusal. In fact, let's just go back and note that there, where he says, I won't believe it. He sort of stubbornly refuses to accept that this ghost is here. And that will be quite interesting when we look at how that compares to when he meets the other ghosts. So then when we go up to the top of page 9, it says, his colour changed though, when without a pause it came on through the door and passed into the room before his eyes. That's just like what happens in the film. You know, the ghost kind of just comes through the door. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up, as though it cried, I know him, Marley's ghost, and fell again. So here we've got kind of a little subheading, because now this is sort of the second part really of stave 1. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts and the hair upon his head. So it's just saying that he looked the same as he did 7 years ago. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. So firstly, the chain is long, let's highlight that as well, and it's wound about him like a tail. So this is almost suggesting that it's almost like it's become a part of him. And the fact that it's wound about him emphasizes how difficult it is to remove. You know, he's almost become entangled in it. So we can put that up. He's tangled up in it. And I guess then that's is suggesting this idea that he's trapped by it, isn't he? Now we know that these chains are symbolic of his past, and we can see that it's made up of things that concern his past, his obsession with money and owning things. So deeds would be like, you know, deeds to property and things like that, and heavy purses. So the chain is symbolic of his past, and we can even put his past wrongdoings. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. Now he means that just because he can see right through him. Nor did he believe it, even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. So this incredulous means that, like, he is disbelieving. So he still doesn't really believe it, but you know, he's trying, he's fighting against his senses. He's trying to not see what he can see. How now? Said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. What do you want with me? Much. Marley's voice. No doubt about it. Who are you? Ask me who I was. Who were you then? Said Scrooge, raising his voice. You're particular for a shade. He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley. Can you sit down? Asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. I can. Do it then. Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. but the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. Now, interestingly, I think this is almost sort of supposed to be a little bit of kind of light humour. Remember at the beginning, on that very, very first page, on the kind of front cover, Dickens says that he wants this to be an entertaining story. And here we've got this kind of awkward and funny exchange where Scrooge feels like he should ask the ghost to sit down, but he's not quite sure if he'll be able to do that, essentially because he's transparent. But I think what's important here is that this is not a sinister, dark ghost story. This is just playing into that tradition of telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve, because Dickens wants as many people to read this story as possible, so that they can hear his message of goodwill to others, and learn the lesson, and learn from the mistakes of Scrooge. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Now, essentially, what Scrooge is going on about here is he feels that he doesn't believe that Marley is a ghost, and when Marley kind of calls him out on that and says, "Well, why don't you trust what you're seeing? Why do you doubt your senses?" Scrooge is basically saying, "Well, I might have just eaten something that's upset my tummy and is sort of making me see things." So he's blaming seeing the ghost on a tummy ache, I guess. So if we just put a little note here, thinks he is seeing things, and we can put blames the ghost on an upset tummy, essentially. Like a bit of food poisoning, I guess, which certainly in the days when they didn't have fridges and freezers would be even more common than it is today. All right, so hopefully that bit makes sense. Okay, let's move on to page 10. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, but the spectre's voice disturbed him to the very marrow in his bones. So spectre is just another word for ghost, and he's admitting here that he is disturbed and he is trying to keep down his terror. So he is fearful of the ghost. To sit staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for the ghost sat perfectly motionless. Its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapour from an oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, notwithstanding. "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round his head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. So essentially what's going on here is Jacob Marley obviously is as a ghost, even as a ghost, sort of falling apart, and so his head is kind of like bandaged up together, or maybe it relates to how he died, and in some kind of gruesome image, his jaw kind of drops away from the rest of his face. And so Marley is doing this probably to shock Scrooge into believing that he's real. So we can just note that here if that's helpful. Marley shocks Scrooge into believing he's real. Okay, so these kind of notes just help you to understand what's going on, and especially, when you come back year on year, it's important to remember what, especially because the language is and the sentence structures are so dense. It helps just to kind of pick out what the main ideas are. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy!" he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" So we can see suddenly that he believes in this ghost. "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness." So let's look at this bit then in terms of what the Ghost of Marley says. He says, "It is required of every man that the spirit within him," so not the man himself, but the spirit within him, "should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide." Okay, so what this is basically saying is, as a person, not every actual man, but every human, every person, the spirit within him, should walk among his fellow men and travel far and wide. And this means kind of be within society, live within society, and be part of his community. So I guess we could note here what it's saying is Jacob Marley has learned that when he was alive, so if we put when living, he has learned that people should contribute towards their community. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. All right, so it's saying if you kind of don't contribute towards your community in life, then you will be forced to do so, condemned to do so. Can't even spell forced. Forced to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Okay, so this you might have heard of the term limbo, but this idea is that the ghost of Jacob Marley is now stuck in limbo, or stuck in this kind of purgatory. And purgatory is when as a sinner, he can't get into heaven because he's sinned, or limbo, this idea that he can't get into heaven because he has sinned. And again, that's linking back to, remember, we have Scrooge described as an old sinner at the beginning. And I've put limbo there, but yeah, you would know the word limbo, hopefully, but technically limbo means something slightly different to do with if you've not actually been baptized. But he sinned, he can't get into heaven. And now we see that he feels a lot of regret about that. Woe is me, is telling us that he regrets what happened. And he says, "And witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness." So what they have to do once they're dead and they can't get into heaven is they have to witness what they can't be part of. Okay, so they have to witness the kind of life that they can't be part of anymore because they're dead. But if they had, but they could have shared it on earth and turned it to happiness. Had they made more of an effort when they were alive. So it's kind of saying that now he has to witness all the bad things in the world that he is not capable of changing anymore. Against the spectre, again the spectre raised a cry. and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." And fettered just means chained. "I wear the chain I forged in life." Now, forged means if you forge something out of metal, it means that you made it. So he says, "I wear the chain I made in life." And it's interesting that he says, "I wear, I forged." These personal pronouns here are showing that he now is taking responsibility for his action. And this chain is a metaphor for all his wrongdoing when he was alive. Okay, and then he says, "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it." So these personal pronouns continue, and he talks about each thing. I did it. It was my choice. So it's only now in death that he's kind of accepted what he did wrong. And then Jacob says, "Is its pattern strange to you?" Basically implying that, do you recognize this as well, that you do all these bad things? Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain." So essentially what's being suggested here is that Scrooge's chain will be even longer because he's got another 7 years of wrongdoing to add to this. So let me just move that down so that you can see my notes. Okay, so Scrooge's chain is longer. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all." So here where Scrooge says, he implores Jacob, and he says, "Tell me more, speak comfort to me, Jacob." So he knows that it's not going to be good news for him, that this is bad news. So he asks Jacob to say something nicer, really, "Speak comfort to me." But Jacob, the ghost of Jacob Marley, says, "I have none to give. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge." So he's saying that he should get comfort elsewhere, and it's going to be conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. So he's basically saying, "Well, that's all I can do. I can't do anything more to help you." And this bit here is really interesting. We've got this repetition. "I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere." And this repetition is showing really how Marley is trapped by his past. And he's sort of held back by his past life. So he can't settle, he can't stay in one place, he can't ever rest. So he's in a kind of eternal damnation. Because of the way he chose to live his life on earth. Okay, so it starts here, "My spirit never," and then we'll move up to the next page. Okay, so he says, "My spirit never My spirit never walked beyond our counting house, mark me. So he's saying his spirit when he was alive, he's never really thought about anything more than their business. So when he was alive, he was totally focused on his business. While he was totally focused on their business. Mark me. And here this where he says mark me is basically Jacob Marley saying, you know, like heed my warning, or could be sort of like look at me, like pay attention. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. So he now accepts that the job that he had was limiting the narrow limits of our money-changing hole. This hole that they were basically like, he was basically kind of sucked into this kind of way of life, is being suggested there, and now he has to pay the price. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and then we will record the next bit, which will take us up to the end of stave 1. So we're nearly there.